RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. I am back from my winter break, in which we loaded up the Vermilion Moose caboose and we headed down to the desert. So we visited White Sands National Park, we visited City of Rocks State Park, we visited Saguaro National Park, and I also visited the Bosque del Apache. And in all those places, the family had a great time, and I took lots of photos, including landscapes and all kinds of bird photos, some of which were lifers, so that was awesome for me. And now I'm back in the shop. And now I need to figure out where I left off with that custom desk build that I started before the break. So let's go on over to the bench, take a look at where I'm at, and figure out where to go from here. All right, so here's where I'm at, and here's where I think I'm going next here. So when I got back, I checked some things like the length of my aprons to make sure that they were even. And my aprons weren't the exact same length, and of course they need to be if I don't want to glue up a desk that is a little bit out of square. So I needed to address that. And also I noticed that for my reference edges, the track saw cuts that I did over there when I cut these to final length didn't cut perfectly square either. So I had a length issue and a squareness issue I had to address. And of course I just took care of that on the shooting board. So that part was pretty straightforward. So now my aprons are the exact same length. Both the side aprons are the same length as each other. The front and rear aprons are the same length as each other. And all of the ends of all those aprons are square now. So what that leaves me are some legs. These legs have only been cut out to very, very rough shape. I don't even have a reference edge yet because this straight edge here isn't straight. It was just cut out on the bandsaw. So I need to create a straight edge with a jointer plane. And of course, make sure that straight edge is square to at least one of the faces, if not both. Because these faces are parallel to each other, it should be both. At that point, I'll have a reference edge from which I can cut these to final length, make sure that they're square on the shooting board if need be. And then I can go to shaping these curves. And that's kind of the fun part for me. I like doing curves. And of course, I want to put some nice wide chamfers that follow this curve as well. That's always a good time. So let's do that next. So I'm going to get out the joiner plane and create a reference edge on these legs. Okay, so that went pretty well. The crosscuts I did on the ends of these legs ended up very close to square. And these aren't a joinery surface anyways, so it's not that important to me that that be perfectly square. More important, really, for me is that these end up being the same length, so that my front two legs, which are one length, are both the same length, and my back two legs, which are a little bit longer, are also the same length as each other. And that ended up being the case, so that worked out great. All I'm going to have to do to address the ends of these from here on out is like surface prep, removing the saw blade marks. So now I'm moving on to doing the curves on the opposite side of the leg from the reference edge. And in this case, I'm ganging these two legs together so I can see which part of which leg is higher than the other, because I want to try to get these as even to each other as possible. And my weapon of choice for that is this guy right here. This is a compass plane. Obviously, this one is a vintage make. This is a Stanley number 113. They don't make them like this anymore. And in fact, no modern manufacturer of hand planes makes a compass plane to the best of my knowledge, except for maybe, what was that company? Kurtz. However, I don't find the quality of that brand name to be really worthwhile. So it's really unfortunate that you can't get one of these anymore. I did, however, replace the blade with a Hawk blade. Thankfully, there's a replacement that fits this plane because the blade that came with this was an utter mess. So I'm lucky I was able to do that and make it a usable plane again, because this is really what I like to use for curves like this. If you're looking for alternatives, if you don't have a compass plane and don't want to try to pick one up from eBay and fix it up and all that jazz, you could use an oscillating spindle sander. The thing is, this is such a wide sweeping curve, it would be pretty hard to kind of get this to be a nice fair curve, as we call it, one that has a nice transition. That's one option. If you're in more of a production environment, you could use a big router with like a template guide and batch out a whole bunch of legs that way. But because I'm only doing a few legs at a time, I tend to just lean towards the hand tool route and kind of enjoy what I'm doing, even if it takes just a little bit longer. So for those of you who are like, compass plane, what the heck is a compass plane? Well, I'll show you what a compass plane is. So if you look at this compass plane from the edge here, you can see that it has a bendy sole on it. So you can adjust the sole of this plane to cut both inside and outside curves just by bending the sole with this front knob right here. That's why they call it a compass plane, is because it can cut radii, basically, or at least plane them. I like to use this for inside curves in particular. For outside curves, it's a little bit wonky. Like anything that can cut curves, that's a hand tool, it does require a little bit of technique. And so what you're trying to do here is treat it similarly to like a round bottom spoke shave, in which you're trying to ride the part of the sole of the plane that's right in front of the mouth. And if you can control it that way with the front and rear handles, you can get a nice clean cut that way. The other thing you want to do is, because this has an adjustable sole on it, say I'm trying to cut this part of the curve right here. I want to adjust the sole so that it rocks just a little bit, and that makes it easier to ride that part of the sole that's right in front of the mouth, and so I can take a nice cut that way. If it's too tight of a curve and rocks a ton, it makes it harder to run just on that spot. So conversely, if you're doing an outside curve, you would adjust the sole of the plane the other way such that the radius that you're bending the sole to is just wider than the one that you're trying to cut. And again, so it just rocks a little bit on the curve, and then you can ride the front of the mouth of the blade like that. So that's what we're trying to do here. So let me go back the other way. Right now I'm just trying to cut this little bit straighter part. If this part of the leg was longer, I could probably even just use a bench plane to knock down the high spots on this. But this is working well enough. So starting out, because my my bandsaw technique is not quite so smooth, I have some kind of high spots and waves that I need to knock down. And because I have these, well, you can see that I'm going against the grain there. So this whole strategy of getting these together so I can try to do them at the same time isn't working out so great, because I have to go this direction on this leg. It is what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and finish out this one, working the high spots down, varying this section of the leg, and then increasing the curvature of the sole of the compass plane, and working my way up to this end of the leg where the curve is the tightest. And then I will be able to compare my legs to each other, see where one leg is a little bit higher than the other, address any high spots, try to get these as equal to each other as I can, and then I can move on to the other legs. So that's pretty much all there is to that. But in this case, I'm going to have to flip this leg around and work in from this end in order to address the high spots on this leg. right, so I have smoothed all the bandsaw marks off of here. I've faired the curves with the compass plane. I got them to match each other, nice and close. Now I have legs that are starting to take shape here, quite literally and figuratively, I suppose. So they have a nice curve to them. They look nice and strong, which I like, but they also look pretty chunky, which I also don't like. So what I want to do is make some big wide chamfers that follow the curve of the leg, and that will kind of narrow out the outside profile of each of the legs. That would be the curved edge of each of the legs. So I want to thin this up a little bit. That visual weight there needs to be removed. So what I'm going to do is mark out my chamfers. I've measured these. I want to take about 1/5 off of each edge of what the overall thickness is. That ends up being about 8 millimeters, or more like 8.5, but I'm just going to round it to 8. And what I'm going to use for that is this tool right here. So this guy here is the Incra T-Rule, and this thing is just awesome. It's one of my favorite measuring and marking tools in my entire shop. So basically what it is a piece of spring steel that's got some etchings on it and laser cut holes, and those holes are sized to accept the tip of a 0.5 mechanical pencil like I like to use. And basically all you need to do is put the fence up against your reference edge and drop the tip of the pencil in the appropriate hole, and then you can just use like a panel gauge. So basically what you do is put your stock on there. I'm going to drop this into the 8 millimeter hole with my 0.5 mechanical pencil. Put this up against the edge here so it stays. And I've already done one of these legs. I'm just going to drag it along the edge like that, and that's going to mark one edge of my big wide long chamfer that's following this curve here. And you can see that the gauge follows the curve of the leg just fine. And then I'll show you something else when I mark the other side of the chamfer. That's pretty cool too. Now, of course, because this 0.5 mechanical pencil is black and this is walnut, you're probably not going to be able to see this very well, but thankfully I can see it well enough to plane to it later. Now, let's figure out what we want to do for how wide of a chamfer we want here. And I'll show you something that's kind of cool about this Incra T-Rule. So I have my marking along this edge, and now I need to mark along the faces of the legs, and that I want to be quite a bit wider. So the way I figure that out is I look at how wide the foot of the leg is. In this case, it's about 55 mil or so, and I want to take about 20% of this distance here to make my chamfer. So it's going to be a lot wider on this face than it is on this face down here. So that's going to be about 21 mil or so. And the cool thing about the Incra T-Rule with using a stock this long is I can get a variable width chamfer by running it along this curve. So you'll look at this end of the curve, starting out, the stock is right up against it where I would be marking. And then as I get in further to where the curve is nice and strong, a gap opens up between the fence and the leg here. Let me bring it a little closer so you can see that. So you see a little gap right there. At this point in the curve of the leg, the chamfer is necessarily narrower because where I'm marking is further away from the inside edge of this fence, right? And then as I move down and things straighten out, the chamfer gets wider again as it meets to the bottom of the leg. So I'm going to have a custom angle, variable width, variable angle chamfer along this that is really only possible because I'm using hand tools. Let's go ahead and mark that out. Now, say I didn't want that variable width chamfer there. I have another Incra T-Rule from back when I used to use more imperial measurements, so it's a 3-inch long one. And that one has a really stubby fence. It's not near as long as this one is. So that one would follow the curve a lot more closely than this one does. If for some reason I wanted to avoid a variable width, I could do it using that narrower stock. And it would be at least less variable than this one. So I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's my layout line right there. Back to the compass plane. You know, so much of hand tool woodworking really is just marking out layout lines and then removing material down to them. I mean, yeah, that's oversimplifying things, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's really that simple. So I come in here with my compass plane and remove material until my planing marks just kiss both of those lines. And of course I need to be cognizant of what my planing direction is. Looks like I'm a little bit against the grain here, so I'm going to have to adjust this way. Move this side like so, and plane like this. So what I like to do with the compass plane is actually come in from one end instead of leaving off of one end, because when you leave off of one end and you're trying to ride the sole that's right in front of the mouth of the plane, it tends to kind of angle off when you do that. So I like to come in from the ends if I can, if the grain direction allows it. Otherwise, I just do my best and come back at it with, card scrapers or something afterwards, maybe even a spoke shave just to do a little touch up. This is what I'm going to be doing for quite some time. All right, so these legs are starting to look pretty good, in my opinion. What started out looking kind of chunky, kind of inelegant, is now starting to look pretty svelte, pretty curvaceous, dare I say sexy, but sexy in a kind of a strong kind of way, not a waif kind of way, right? This still has a pretty strong stance to it. It's amazing to me what these big wide chamfers that follow the curve do for the shape of the leg and the overall look of it. It's pretty impressive in my opinion, and I'm really liking the way these are starting to look. But now I'm ready to move on to the next step, which is the apron to leg joinery. Obviously, the main type of joinery you're going to use in a project is a pretty large decision point and planning of a project. So the way I see it, I have three options. I could do hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. I could do dowel joinery using my Dowel Max joinery system, which I've done a couple of videos about, and I totally love that thing. But ultimately, what I think I'm going to be using here is this guy. This is the Festool Domino XL. So sorry to all you hand tool purists, but it's just what I got to do for a couple of reasons. One of which is I'm giving my buddy a deal on this project. So there's not a whole ton of profit built into this. And so it behooves me to do this in as efficient a manner as possible for that reason, but also structurally speaking, the shape of the dominoes, I think, make the most sense for this project. I think they will give it the most strength while remaining efficient. So that's why I've ultimately decided to go this route. Now, some of the principles I'm going to be talking about here are specific to the machine, but some things like the thickness of the dominoes that you choose are really universal principles that apply to any kind of mortise and tenon joinery, because ultimately that's what a domino is. It's just a floating tenon, right? So I hope you'll stick around with me for what's coming up next here. Now, if this table was, or this desk was something that was a little more straightforward, where all your aprons are straight, they're nice and thick, you have all legs that are all the same height, this would be pretty simple just using the settings on the machine. My design, however, is not simple. If you'll recall, the aprons have a taper to them. That complicates things. The aprons actually slope up as they go to the back of the desk, and the back legs are longer than the front legs. There's a lot of ins and outs and what have yous going on here that make this a little bit more complicated. So after looking at all my parts, doing a whole bunch of measuring and holding dominoes up to the different parts to see how they're going to play both with the parts and with each other, I think I got it all figured out. So why don't I show you what I got going on here, and then we'll actually go ahead and cut these mortises. All right, so just to kind of give you an example of some of the things I'm up against when it comes to figuring out the domino joinery on this. So this is the end of one of the front aprons here. You can see how it has a pretty aggressive taper to it. And so what I need to do is figure out what thickness of dowel and what length to use. And it's going to have to be different as you move down the taper. So moving in a little bit, maybe about 20 mil in from that upper corner, what I needed to do was measure the thickness there. That ends up being something like 22, 23 mil, something like that. What I want to choose for the thickness of domino is something that's about maybe 1/3 that thickness, or as close as I can get to it without choosing too dinky of a domino. So what I end up deciding on is an 8 mil domino, and this one is 80 millimeters long, so that will go right about there on the end grain there. Moving in down from that a little bit more, I want to put a second domino for added strength. However, because of the taper here, I'm only at about maybe 18 mil thick once you move in about, 50 mil from the top corner there. So ultimately, the thickness I'm going to have to use there is this 6 mil thick domino. And this one's only 40 millimeters long. Unfortunately, I don't have any that are longer than that. I don't know if the machine can even cut one that's deeper than the 40. So this is what I'm going to have to do. So big, thick, long domino here, a little bit thinner, a little bit stubbier one here. You might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not going to be strong enough to hold the aprons to the legs, and that's true. But thankfully, I've thought about this way ahead of time, and ultimately, this is just the first stage of attaching the aprons to the legs. I'm going to be doing some things to the interior structure of the desk that will help shore up this connection between the aprons and the legs that I hope you will agree is going to put it over the top and make it plenty strong enough. That's kind of what I'm doing with the aprons. Now, with the legs, I don't have as much to consider. They're nice and thick. They give me lots of room for mortises. However, where they come in from this side needs to leave room for the other aprons to come in from the other side. So I do have to offset my dominoes a little bit such they don't stick so far in here that my mortises intersect inside the leg. Obviously, that could cause a problem. So I had to figure all that out, and ultimately, this is what I came up with. And I wrote it all down because it's a little bit different for every apron, the front, the side, the front legs, the back legs, the way all of those intersect with each other is different. So I had to write it all down. So at first glance, this joinery schedule here that I have written up looks absolutely nuts, but I promise you it's not that complicated. So the way my front aprons are going to attach to my front legs is going to use an 8x80 domino at the top and a 6x40 domino below it. The parentheses here are going to show the depth of the mortise. So on the left side, the apron is going to have a 50 mil deep mortise for this domino, and the front leg is going to have a 30 mil deep mortise. And then if you come over here, you'll see that it's going to be 20 mil down from the upper corner of the front apron and 24 mil down from the upper corner of the front leg. And the reason I have these two numbers different is because I want the leg to actually stick out a little bit, about 4 millimeters from the top of my aprons and my desk surface. So that's the way that's kind of all laid out. And you can see when I do the side aprons to the front legs, I have a little bit different numbers for the depth of mortise here because I don't want those mortises to intersect with each other. Then you would end up having dominoes bumping into each other inside the leg and the whole joint would not go together. So that's now bueno, so you got to account for that. Side aprons to the back legs, a little bit different, right? Because the side aprons have a different shape to them where they meet the legs. So the upper domino is going to be a 6x40. And it's just going to be, 20 millimeters deep mortise on both sides of the joint. And it's going to be down a little bit different distance from the upper corner of the side apron and the back leg because of the way it's shaped. And then below that is going to be an 8x80 domino. And you can see the offset of the mortises there, and so on and so forth. The strongest connection is easily going to be the back apron. I'm using 3 8x80 dominoes. 50 mil into the apron, 30 mil into the back leg, because I left my back apron untapered. It's nice and big and tall and thick, so that accounts for that. On the back here, I just made a note to myself that all the aprons, the mortise is going to be centered about 10 millimeters in from the reference edge. On the inside edge of all the legs, that's going to be 20 millimeters in from that reference corner at the inside of the leg. And on the inside face of all the legs, it's going to be about 40 millimeters in from that reference corner on the inside of the leg. So if that doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will in a moment. But this is kind of what I ended up doing to kind of work through all the joinery and then look at the legs, check all these measurements, and make sure that everything works out. There's a couple spots here where I actually erased and wrote new numbers when I realized that it wasn't going to work out the way I thought in my head. So I'm going to go ahead and follow this schedule when cutting all the mortises. Okay, so I don't really intend for this video to be a treatise on how to use the Domino XL. I feel like there's plenty of other videos on YouTube that kind of cover this thing in great detail. Honestly, I don't think that's probably why most of my viewers watch my stuff anyways. They're probably here more for the hand tool end of things anyways. So I'm not going to really go into this all that much. That said, there are a couple of third-party manufacturers that make little doodads that make this thing so much more versatile than it would be otherwise. So for those of you who haven't looked into it too much, there's actually two different domino machines. There's the regular domino, and then this one here is the Domino XL. The regular domino cuts small mortises, so any kind of small projects and smaller furniture projects it would be good for. The Domino XL cuts larger mortises that are more suited towards large furniture projects. And if you're like me and you do projects of all sizes, that kind of puts you into a bit of a conundrum, because then you're like, I don't really want to have to buy both machines given how ridiculously expensive they are, because Festool. With all that said, there are ways around it. So this little doodad here, I'll bring it out closer so you can see it, is made by Seneca Woodworking. And this is a little adapter that allows you to put regular domino cutter heads into the Domino XL and use them just like normal. And that is awesome. So in that sense, the Domino XL suddenly becomes kind of a two tools in one kind of deal. So look to Seneca Woodworking if you're going to pick up the domino. I would recommend getting the Domino XL, getting this adapter, and then you're good to cut all sizes of mortises that the domino can cut. So that's one of the tools. The other one is this guy here. So I don't have a table saw. I don't really have the wherewithal to cut small projects out of plywood and do them up like this. So I just went ahead and supported Ramon Valdez. There's his logo right there. This is what he calls the domino dock. You can see underneath here there's a lip that hangs off the front end of the bench. And you can put that lip into your leg vise or whatever you're using for a front vise. And that basically acts as a cradle for your domino or your Domino XL. He makes domino docks for both of those tools. And now this thing is stood up on end in such a way that it's right under my nose. I can see what I'm doing. I don't have to bend over to use it. And what you would typically do with this is bring your smaller parts, at least, over to the tool, as opposed to trying to figure out a way to immobilize this workpiece and then bring the tool to the workpiece. And of course, if you have a whole bunch of small parts that you're trying to batch out, you can just sit here with a whole stack of them and cut your mortises and move from one to the next, and just blast right through it. And it's absurd. You can cut 40 mortises in less than 10 minutes. It's amazing. So I could easily recommend you get a domino dock as well if you pick up one of the domino machines. I have some other things by Seneca Woodworking in particular that make this machine more versatile than it is, just out of the box. Those things are just awesome, but because I'm not using them for this project, I'm not going to really talk about them. If I've assumed incorrectly and you really would like to see me go through all the ins and outs of these tools as I know them, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and cut all my mortises now. So got my machine set up, got my power cord hooked up to my Festool vacuum such that it turns on automatically when I turn on the domino. And I got my dust hose attached as well. And that's one of the reasons that I've got Festool in the first place. A big one is that the dust collection on these tools are both integrated and effective. Hardly anything gets out of this machine while I'm using it. I don't have to wear a dust mask. I don't have to worry about fine particles of dust lodging in my lugs semi-permanently and potentially causing cancer. So to me, at least, it's worth the money to have some of these tools. And I understand people's frustrations with it. I'm often frustrated myself with how expensive some of this stuff is. But because I kind of sort of do this for a living, at least part-time, it's worth it to me to have some of this stuff. So all that said, to paraphrase the King of Soul, James Brown, excuse me while I do the boogaloo. Okay, so I got a whole bunch of mortises cut in very short order. I got them all cut except for one. And the reason for that is I actually plunged a mortise in the incorrect location. This despite all of the notation that I have, and even having marked a center line on the leg where the mortise was supposed to be. So that is a pretty serious brain fart on my part. It's probably the most malodorous, offensive to the nose brain fart I've had in quite some time. So that leaves me with a decision to make. I can either remake the leg, which means I have to go to the lumber dealer, buy more lumber, cut it out, do all the work I've done to this point basically, and then replunge the mortises, or I could fix the mortise that I misplunged and kind of continue on. So anybody who's been in woodworking long enough will eventually learn how to fix mistakes. And whenever I make a mistake in a video, somebody will always go to the comments section and repeat that quote that nobody knows who originally said it. That's basically like, a crass person isn't somebody who doesn't make mistakes. A crass person is somebody who knows how to fix their mistakes. That's what I ended up deciding to do. And the first thing I did in this case was stuff a domino in there with some hide glue. It's very important that I fill that void with solid wood because the correct mortise is going to be right next to the incorrect one. And it's important that I use hide glue because old hide glue will stick to new hide glue and vice versa. Whereas if you have PVA glue in there and you need to glue something later on, new PVA glue will not stick to old PVA glue. You have to remove all the old stuff before the new stuff will stick. Once that glue is cured, I cut it flush with a flush cut saw, and then I marked out a little square mortise using a marking knife. And then I excavated that mortise using a little Forstner bit on my drill press, and then chiseling out the rest until I had a nice shallow rectangular mortise where the misplaced plunging of the domino mortise was in the leg. At that point, I needed to make a patch to fill that mortise with. So I went around and looked at the scraps I had laying around and found one that matched the color and the grain pattern as closely as possible, and then cut that out using saws and chisels, and then kind of trimming it down on a shooting board until I got it to just barely fit into that mortise. And I even tapered it a little bit so it would kind of wedge in there. And then I put some hide glue on that and tapped it home using a little striking block. And then I let that cure overnight, and now it looks like this. So you can see where my patch is, and then you can see, hopefully you can see that, there's a center line where that mortise was supposed to be that I have no idea how I missed when I plunged this. What I need to do now is just plane that flush, and hopefully it'll all but disappear. Most of this is actually going to be covered by the apron once it's glued in place. So I got that going for me. There's only going to be a tiny corner of this patch visible in the end product. So let's go ahead and plane it down and see how it looks. Now, a lot of times when you see people cut stuff like this flush, they'll use like a block plane. I tend to prefer a larger plane personally. I like to rest the heel of the plane behind the patch and kind of plane up it until everything levels out flush, and then I can use a really light cut with something like the smoothing plane here and avoid leaving any little plane tracks on either side of the patch like you might accidentally do if you're using a block plane. So I'm going to go ahead and plane this down, and I'm using kind of a light cut, but I don't have that much further to go either, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it like this. There we go. Now, much lighter cut. Just like that. I'll use a lighter cut still, I think. There we go. I don't want to take too much material off because this is a joinery surface, and if I get too crazy and take off, like a millimeter of material or something like that, then my final glue up of the legs to the aprons will end up a millimeter out of square, right? So there it is, cut flush. You can definitely see there's a patch there, but it's, like I said, almost all is going to be covered up by an apron. And the important thing to me is that there isn't a black gap around the patch. That would stand out, particularly once I get the finish on here that I like to use for walnut, which is a combination of Danish oil, then a shellac, and then a top coat. The Danish oil in particular will darken this wood significantly, and so any little gap that is there would likely disappear at that point, but I don't want to have any showing nonetheless. I want this nice and tight, and it is nice and tight. There is no gap around that patch at all. So I think it's basically going to disappear once I get some Danish oil on there, and of course cover the bulk of it with an apron. And this is a back leg, by the way, so this isn't going to be, you know, plainly visible in the front of the leg when you look at the front of the desk. Got a lot going for me as far as this repair is concerned, and I'm glad it worked out in the end. So now I just need to plunge that mortise in the correct spot, which is kind of right next to here, and then I can move on with the rest of the project. All right, well, that was exciting. So that just goes to show that even a tool that's as uniquely capable as a Domino XL isn't going to do the work for you. You saw in that vignette that I showed that if you don't hold the tool just right, you can cut a crooked mortise. If you plunge too quickly, you can cut a mortise that's really rough and doesn't glue very well. And of course, if you don't set the fence correctly, you can plunge a mortise in entirely the wrong spot. So that's why it's always funny to me when people like to criticize other people's choice of tool and say that that tool or other is cheating, which to me is hilarious because it displays an ignorance of the tool that's being used. And not only that, a very self-assured ignorance, which is very common on the internet. As far as I'm concerned, you can do your woodworking however you want. If you want to CNC and 3D print everything you make, totally cool with me. If you want to make fine furniture using a single chisel made from a sharpened beaver's tooth that was handcrafted by Tibetan village people, whatever works for you, man, is fine with me. Now you can make the argument that the former is less of a display of craftsmanship than the latter. That might be a valid point, but outside of that, man, it's all woodworking as far as I'm concerned. So I hope you'll agree that woodworking is fun no matter how you do it. I feel like I've reached a good stopping point for this episode. The next step for me, I think, is going to be attaching the aprons to the legs so I can measure the distance between those aprons. And that will then allow me to start filling out the interior structure of the desk, which is going to be things like drawer pockets and those interior battens that support the work surface. I think that's what's up in the next episode. I appreciate you joining me for this one, and we'll see you in the next one. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.